This is Permission to Play, a podcast for creatives who sometimes wonder, where the F did my mojo go? My moxie, my marbles. Why am I so stuck, lost, depressed? God, how do I break free? Well, I have something I live by. Think less, play more. This podcast is your permission to play. Together we'll explore all things helpful for the care and feeding of the creative soul. Welcome. I'm your host, Chatty Kathy.
Oh, Chatty Kathy, all the tails famous talking down. We pull the ring, and you say 11 different things. I love you.
Just pull the ring. You never know what she'll say next.
Keeping it. Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. This is a conversation I had as an interviewee on Memoir Lane podcast earlier last year about my memoir, Born Again Again. That time I fell down a rabbit hole and spent 22 years as a Bible-thumping, tongue-speaking, gospel-preaching, born-again Christian, and then I woke up. My book was a #1 new release on Amazon and a finalist in both the 2021 Next Generation Indie Book Awards and the 15th Annual National Indie Excellence Awards. The host of Memoir Lane podcast, Allison Santana, was a delight to chat with. She had some great questions, and we went both deep and playful. Allison graciously gave me permission to share this conversation with you here, in case you missed it when it came out originally on her podcast. Please support Allison and Memoir Lane by checking her out on your favorite podcast platforms. Allison's links are also in the show notes. Thanks for joining us, and enjoy.
I'm so happy to have you here. I really, really loved your book. It was beautifully written.
Thank you.
The title of your book, which is an amazing title, it's called Born Again Again. That time I fell down a rabbit hole and spent 22 years as a Bible-thumping, tongue-speaking, gospel-preaching, born-again Christian, and then I woke up. I've got to ask you about that title. Please tell me more.
I knew it needed a subtitle because that title could mean any number of things, and I wanted to be fair to readers so that they knew what they were getting into. And I played around with a lot of subtitles, and I leaned toward the humor, so that kind of rattled out one day, and I'm like, why can't that be it? And so I just chose that. Toward the end, I hired an editor who was amazing, and she loved it. So I said, okay, I'm keeping it.
I love it too. As soon as I saw it, I was like, okay, I'm completely interested. Like, what?
Oh,
It's a
I
great
love
title.
to hear that. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah,
It's taken a
welcome.
minute for me to memorize it, so I can actually, when somebody asks me what's the title of your book, I'm like, well, it's Born Again Again.
That time I found
Yeah.
I can't even say. I'm not even going to try to say.
No, I know.
But that's awesome. Let's talk about how you grew up, where you're from, and your family dynamic.
I grew up just your typical middle-class white girl, nothing peculiar, except, there were some dynamics around my childhood with my parents. I want to be a little careful here. I still have a parent living,
Oh, I
although he's
understand.
94 and would probably never hear this. I do love him, but there was some dynamics growing up with fights, a lot of arguing, traumatic stuff that little ears tuned into. I was the youngest of 3, but they were 10 and 12 years older than me. So there was a giant gap. I was kind of an only child in a lot of ways because they were already out of the house. I spent a lot of time alone, and my parents worked and my mom had a business. And so from the time I was born, my parents' marriage was already on the rocks. In the book, I tried to keep connecting parts of my journey back to my childhood, because I feel like our childhood plays so much into our adult choices and our adult lives. I think I can definitely say there was trauma, which I know is relative, but for me, it was there. I raised myself in a lot of ways.
That is something I do relate to. My mom worked a lot, and I'm a child who went through divorce, and I've seen all the arguments and things that kind of build up to those moments and the fracture in the family. And I definitely do believe, like you said, it's relative and we live what we learn. Do you feel like that family dynamic is what made you want to search for God or get closer and investigate your curiosity?
I do think that the family trauma played a greater role a bit later in life, because at the time I recall that I still had a deep curiosity around spiritual things around God. We were not a religious family by any means. We weren't churchgoers. I think I remember one time my mom took me to a church service for some strange reason on Easter. I had no exposure through my family at all. I like to say that I used to think God's last name was Dammit because that was really the only reference I ever heard. But I still had a curiosity, especially from seeing things on TV or movies about Jesus. There was definitely something there that called to me, and I had a lot of imaginings around it, but I didn't know what to do with that as a youngster. So I just tucked it away and carried it with me. And that kept revisiting, though. It kept coming back throughout my life, that sort of like existential moments of what is all of this, and what is real, and who is God, and who am I, and what am I, and a lot of introspection and just deep wonderings about the nature of who I was and what life was about, and was there a God? That just was kind of naturally there.
I feel like I'm having an existential crisis every day.
Me too.
What does it all mean?
Yes.
Give me the answer already.
That's part of what got me into trouble, was I kept asking. I'm like, I don't know what the truth is. Somebody just tell me the truth and I'll believe you.
Yeah, give me a direction. Give me something to believe in. Show
I'm
me a
learning.
path.
Yeah, I'm learning a lot of that comes from the very center of ourselves. And I'm later in life now. A lot of the answers keep coming back to look inside yourself. Quit looking and asking everybody else to tell you what the truth is. Find it inside yourself. Not discounting something higher and bigger. I'm just saying, I keep looking to humans to tell me what that is instead of finding it for myself, connecting
Right.
to that, aside from somebody else being the intermediary.
Exactly. I do understand what you mean by that. We're always looking outside of ourselves for the fulfillment and the answers, and nobody knows any more than we do. But for some reason, we believe that other people do have the answers or the wisdom, and we tend to seek it out in them, which is a nice segue to the church, because what you speak of in your book, there's a lot of dynamics in the church where you are looking to the elders, the pastors, prophets. I think I want to ask you first how you came to beginning your path with Christianity and coming to the church.
Back to the everlasting existential search. What was with me into young adulthood, I had an epiphany. I would get into these usually at night when I was either going to sleep or waking up, these spaces of deep, like maybe nowadays there's words for it, like panic attack or anxiety, I guess. It would always lead to a lot of soul searching and crying out to whatever, asking God, are you real? What are you? One point while I was in the thick of going to performing arts school, like really diving into my career of choice, which was acting school, I had a visitation. I don't know how else to describe it. During a moment of deep longing and crying out for some relief to these questions about what is real, and is God real, and what's my connection? Who's Jesus? I had something happen where a presence descended on me in the most soft, incredible blanket of what I can only describe as love. I suddenly had this moment of all of those questions just melting. I softened into that presence and just let it hold me. And all of a sudden it was okay. I was okay. And my questions didn't matter in that moment. It was just an incredible experience. It wasn't a dream because I was fully awake. I just knew I had heard from God, and I didn't know what that meant or what that was going to translate into. But that was the huge turning point for me, where I began to consider religion. And I put big air quotes around that because I didn't know how else to frame it at that point. That experience at that point in my life equated to, oh, you have to attach that then to some specific religion. My friend, who in the book I call Patricia, who went to performing arts school with me, was my frame of reference. And she was a very devout Christian. She was like super straight laced, and I was like the opposite of that. We struck up an unlikely friendship. She had been sharing her faith, but not in a preachy kind of way. She lived it. And I admired that she was so convicted and could be in this den of iniquity that we were in acting school in Hollywood. So I immediately took that and turned all of my questions toward her and her understanding of her faith. So that's the segue into what led me toward Christianity.
I know you said that we do have language for those kind of events, but usually those things don't end in such a warm and loving after experience. Years on, do you still feel that same way about that experience, that you had that encounter with God?
Yeah, so there's a big interim there where I then categorized it and gave it a lot of names and labels, and I put it into a box, which happened over time, actually. At the time, it was still this beautiful, wild thing. I was going to say it's unfortunate, but I don't think of anything that way anymore. I really think that my journey is my journey, and I'm okay with it, as crazy as it ended up being. I had to go through a definite mourning experience, mourning what I felt was the loss of 20 plus years of diving into the world I dove into after that. I think that experience was a real thing. There was a huge wrestling match that took place over those subsequent 20 plus years with doing that to this spirit, this other. So now I'm circling back around to connecting with that now again in a different context.
Well, Kathy, I don't know anything about control, so I'm kidding. I'm kidding. It's like, oh, capture and control it?
Yeah.
What's that like? Never been there before. What I found interesting in your book was it's not just a story about you, it's about your family and your community, your friends, your relationship with your friends. But what I found interesting was that you said your kids were not as interested in coming to church.
I don't want to speak to my children's adult thoughts about that because that's their journey and their thing to speak to. They did embrace church for many years. Of course, we brought them up in the church because I didn't have kids when I got in, and then had them within the very deepest portion of my deep dive into the sect of Christianity that I joined, which was the Charismatic, Pentecostal charismania. They were raised in that and they embraced it. My son had an incredibly beautiful conversion experience when he was 3 or 4. They both were very involved in all of the youth worship services. My daughter, we used to dance in services, and so she would dance with me sometimes or dance by herself. They were definitely like spiritually open, but they were having their own experience that I wasn't aware of necessarily because I wasn't the only influence. There was influence of other elders, there was influence of Sunday school teachers, and for a short time my son went to a Christian school that was part of the church. So there was a lot of influence there that I wasn't there to witness, playing its own set of mind games on them that I was oblivious to. It wasn't until out of junior high and my daughter in high school, I'd started to notice that they weren't so interested anymore. I kind of knew that they weren't fitting in really with the youth group. My daughter had a hard time forming relationships there. There were some experiences that, well, with teenagers, and tweeners, you can have those. But at some point, they expressed that they just weren't into it. They didn't want to go to church anymore. That was rough for my husband and I because we had in mind for our kids and what we hoped for them and what you go through in this particular sect of the church. It's all very, this isn't mainstream Christianity. Like, this isn't your typical like Episcopalian or community church. It is very much all or nothing. We're building the kingdom of God here and we're going to convert the world. Evangelism played a huge role. Viewing everyone as lost was huge. Wanting our children to pick up that mantle, which is a buzzword, of believing that that was part of their role as well, and that they would marry godly Christians and that they would choose ministry. Those were all things that we hoped for them. Then to watch their interest wane was very difficult. But we valued our relationship with our kids above all. So it was like, if we say you must go to church, you must do this and that, to us was like, no, that's not an option. We were so tight with them that, and they may not realize this now, but we respected them as humans. I do talk a lot in the book about our disciplinary practices and things like that. So I won't go into that. So I know that there's baggage there that they get to deal with now as adults. But I think at the time they knew that our love was real and it was deep and that we, at our core, respected them as humans. Even if some of our behavior maybe didn't communicate that to them, I think they picked up on that. But them learning their faith brought an interesting little drop of doubt into my faith, because it was like, what's happening here? They're smart. What are they seeing? It was a thread of doubt. I would say that was a signpost in the road, our way out, to where it was like, what's happening with our kids? And what does that mean that they don't hold their beliefs the way we thought they would and that they did? So our kids leaving, this happened over time, and it was slow, but it was definitely a seed planted in my heart. And I think in my husband's too. I'm not going to speak for him, but for sure, for me, it was like, wow.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And thank you for speaking about that. I think that kids have a much less blurry lens to see the world through.
Yeah.
And I think because their lens is way less blurry than ours, I think that if a kid questions something like God and church, if you have a little bit of sanity, their opinions will hold some weight and it will make you question things. In the book, one thing I noticed was that you and your husband seem to be able to really steady each other with some of the shenanigans that were going on in the church. And that is really putting it mildly, because especially towards the end of the book, it's like, whoa, they were what? But it seems like you guys were able to just keep each other balanced and steady. I think that you guys had great intentions when it was either with the discipline or trying to go and be a part of the church and the ministry. See how you guys could incorporate your love of theater and the arts into the church and use that to serve. And you guys have been married for 39 years now.
Yeah.
From what I can read in the book, you guys have a really beautiful relationship. You guys made a lot of space for each other to be who you are within the relationship. It seems like you guys are very open-minded and loving. I would love to know how you make it 39 years with the same person. That's the real question.
I ain't saying it's easy. I'll just put it that way. It takes a lot of work, 100% on each side. And yet also like making space for each other's journey to be there. I think I was blessed, and I'll tell you, I've had to really reclaim that word. I couldn't use it for quite a while after coming out of the church. So much lingo that I've had to like repurpose and redefine in my mind. But I consider our relationship, you say we balanced each other, but really he balanced me. He always had feet of clay, feet on the ground, and Kathy's always like spinning off, bring it in, bring it in. So he was the steadying force quite often. He was the one. We're both creatives, which is, wow, a crazy combo to have two people that are just, always creating and thinking creatively, which it's a good thing because it gives you tools. You can think outside the box, but I'm like you, it's like shiny new things. So I'm like, just what can I do now? I think just giving space for each other, respecting one another, being real with each other. We nurture romance. We still go on dates, but I'm going to give him like 90% of the credit. Holy cow, the dude is so patient with me and my wackiness. But yeah, 39 years, I don't have any magic keys to that one except respect, trying to think the best, being honest with each other. There is one thing that we practice in the church. This was something we learned in the church. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. I think that's in Proverbs. I can't remember. I used to know it all, but I don't anymore. But that was one thing. We don't leave a lot of time, enough time to get out of the emotion of the moment, enough space for that to happen, but always revisiting, reconnecting, and asking forgiveness of each other and trying really hard to see the other person's perspective and let their experience, like allow yourself to empathize with what they're experiencing that's coming from you, and then own your piece of that, not allowing things to fester. I think that's a big one. And we learned some of those skills. Later in the book, I introduce you to a pastor who was also a marriage and family therapist. I'm not saying we didn't find wisdom and people who had good things to teach. I think that we did learn some of that, but I also think we just found each other as soulmates. So that has gone a long way and it's weathered a lot. And I do recognize that it is not common for people to come out of a church experience that's as deep as we went with their marriage intact. I think it helps that we were pretty much connected at the hip going in.
Yeah, I think it speaks a lot to who you are as a person, because stereotypically thinking of an artist, we tend to view them as like egotistical and self-centered. And it doesn't seem like you guys were ever coming from that space, even with your experience in the arts and trying to bring that with you into the church, which is a huge part of the book. It seems like you guys are, although you say you had your head up in the clouds and he was more on the ground, it seems like you guys are two just genuinely loving people. And I think that speaks to a lot of why that relationship is just, it was beautiful to read about for me. I really enjoyed reading about it.
I'm glad. Thank you.
And I'm not surprised to hear you say that you guys still go on dates and don't go to bed angry. And I think that's exactly what I was expecting to hear in your answer.
That's funny. Well, I figure if you can't make it work with like your best friend, if you give up on that, I mean, it's like, could I ask for anything better? You know what I'm saying? Like when there's struggle, which is going to be there, and some people are not compatible. They're just not. And Mike and I are quite different from each other. We're very different. We're wired different and we see the world in different ways. But I always ask myself, okay, if I was in a moment of this isn't working or it's going to end, I just know it, like this moment of desperation. Then you pull the lens back and say, would it be any better with anybody else? I mean, could you find anybody better? That's ridiculous. So what's the common denominator here? Well, it's me. I'm not saying that he doesn't bear fault at times. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it always gives me pause to say, what's my part here? And often, more often than I want to admit, it's a big part. And so I have to eat humble pie and ask for forgiveness.
I can relate to that dynamic a little bit with my partner. We've been together for 9 years and he's so accepting and I'm panicking about everything. And what you were saying, would it be any better with anybody else? Even when I'm trying to think of a million reasons why, we're just so different. We're really not that different. We just have some different interests, but like at the core of who we are, we value the same things, which is like family, loyalty. And yeah, it just feels so good to come home at the end of the day to your person. It's the
Just
best
got your
feeling.
back. Yeah, it is. And also the idea that it's not my job to change him. It's like I'm all in for who you are. And I have to allow him to be who he is. It's not saying that you don't make adjustments. Like I have things about myself that I'm trying to better and trying to own up to, et cetera, et cetera. But whenever there's something about him that I get critical about, it's like, look, you signed up for all of it. It's not your job to join with somebody and say, hey, I'm going to spend my life with you, but I'm going to also try to change this and this and this about you because that bugs me. I think a lot of people try to do that. It's like, no, the person that you have chosen to be with is on a path also. And even though you're together on a path, we also have our own individual journeys that we're on to actualize, realize ourselves and know more about ourselves. And so you can't keep grabbing your partner's hand and trying to yank them onto your path. There's a convergence and a divergence that can happen alongside of each other. And the minute you make yourself aware of, oh my God, I'm trying to change who he is. Did I not accept this whole person? Yes, I did. Okay. What do I need to change about myself in this moment to be able to accept who he is and love who he is and accept where he is on his path and open up more and create more space for him to be who he is on his path right now? Yeah. I don't know. It's a lot of mumbo jumbo, but I think you get it.
I get it. And it goes back to what you were saying, like with your kids, you have to recognize that everybody is having their own experience. And just because you guys are all in the same family or you guys are sleeping in the same bed every night, it does not mean that you guys aren't having your own unfolding, your own point of view.
I love this deep dive because I think relationship is part of what we're here for.
Yeah, it's
part of what
everything.
teaches us. It is. It's what teaches us. It's what hones us. It's what shows us ourselves. And it helps us to learn to love ourselves too. But there is one scripture that we used to depend on in the church that talked about the husband shall leave his family and the two shall become one flesh. I used to try to embody that or like really think about, oh, we are one flesh. But I would bristle at it. I'd be like, no, we're not. We're not one flesh. We're not. We're connected and we're interconnected and we're creating something with this union, but we're not one. I think that in the end, we are all energy and we are all part of the greater thing itself. And we're just like a lot of mirrors showing ourselves to each other,
Exactly.
and learning about ourselves through each other. but we're also deeply individual. And that's the beauty of the creator. Like, how creative can you possibly be that you could show so many facets of the one thing? I mean, we could go way out
I know.
there. And
We definitely could.
there's so many
Yeah.
facets. It's like a jewel.
You
know?
need other people for your self-actualization. We're a little bit obsessive as a culture about the whole individual identity. I'm
Yes.
so guilty of this. I'm always thinking about my self-actualization. Like, I don't care.
It's a
That's your
dance,
problem.
isn't it?
It's a dance, but you cannot have that unfolding without other people.
No.
And you have to realize that they're having the same. They're having their unfolding. You have to give them the room to be who they are and express themselves. And that's what makes relationships so beautiful and complicated. And it's a big part of the thing that people don't want to accept about going into a long-term relationship is that it's really hard to be in a relationship with somebody else, whether it's your friend or your husband who you married at a young age. Or it's hard to be in relation with other people that is a part of the relationship.
I guarantee you it's going to be a mirror for you. It's going to show you. And
Yes.
I can tell you, like, it is, I'm going to say that it is without fail when there's conflict. If I stop 1 second, take a breath, let go of whatever I'm clamping onto with my fangs and say, how can I see myself in this? Flip it around and look in the face of what's making me crazy and making me want to lash out and say, where am I in there? I always see myself. And it's like, holy shit. Oops, there I am. It's like, how am I guilty of this very thing that's pissing me off right now? And it diffuses it every time. It's like, oh, I'm totally guilty of this sometimes. The thing you're doing right now that makes me want to throw my cup of coffee at you, I do that to you too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yet it's like Jesus said, who of you is without sin shall cast the first stone. So there's a lot of wisdom, right, in there.
It's the ultimate learning is being in relationship with others. And
so freaking hard.
It is. And I think for people in my generation, people younger than me even, don't accept that it's hard and that we're going to get it wrong. And one thing me and my partner talk about all the time is that we have been together for 9 years. And he's come with his baggage, like everybody comes with their baggage, but I came with a lot of trauma, especially in the beginning of the relationship, and I made him pay for it. And it's like, just in case you even think about it, I'm going to put this armor up, but you can't go anywhere. You have to stay right here and you have to put up with it. It was a lot of fun. But I think in the last year or two, I was just having this conversation with him the other day because we were always giving each other gratitude. And I said, you've loved me through so much. You've always let me be me, even when I wasn't necessarily letting you be you, or I was not letting him because he's not the kind of person that you can make be somebody else.
Yeah,
That's
I've got one of
another
those
thing.
too. That's good.
Yeah.
It's
I love
helpful.
that about him though,
Yeah.
because if I had a me, ooh, I shudder to think. I want to think about that. But he's not somebody that can be manipulated and bent to be somebody else anyway. But I was like coming to the realization, I just started maybe feeling comfortable to be all of me and not so tense and being able to make room for what we have in like the last year. And I was listening to something Michelle Obama said about how like having 10 bad years out of a 20, 30-year marriage, like that's pretty good. And I was like, I'm not trying to hear that. I've only been in this relationship for 9 years. I'm not trying to hear that. But I think a lot of people, especially young people, are not trying to hear that because especially in the age we're in, it's so easy to believe that something is shinier and better. And with the individualization, we're always told we deserve so much more. Don't settle. So I love the way you wrote about it. And I think having read your book and reflecting on your journey through the church, there's so much that happens while you guys are in the church for 22 years. But I think the reason why you've been able to come out of it, I want to say relatively like unscathed. I feel like some people that you've come across in the book definitely did not get to have that experience of coming out on the other side. is because you guys in each other had a partner that you could trust ultimately.
That was beautiful.
Thank you. I felt really sad when I read the part about your friend Marie, who was struggling to accept you were becoming somebody other than who she recognized. You were wrestling with having to work God into the conversation and fulfill your Christian duty. Could you share that story of Marie?
Yeah, sure. Relationships within the church it was difficult. Like I say, it was like all or nothing. It was like this is your new normal. I hate that phrase. This is your new world. The scriptures about leaving friends and family for the sake of the kingdom were taken very, very seriously. The only reason for having a hook or a tendril still in your old life was to bring people in, to get them saved. Now your church community, this is your new family. Basically, scriptures say that if you don't forsake mother and father, if you don't forsake your family for the kingdom, then you're not really in. You don't really love Jesus enough if you're not willing to let go of people who don't want to come along. So that was a giant grappling for me. And I was deep in my theater community. I'll tell you what, if there is ever a community, when you're in the theater world and the acting world, this is a very tight-knit community. I'm not saying it doesn't have its problems, but that was my world. So to have friends that are lifelong friends, I grew up doing theater. I started young and then went off to performing arts school. These were my people to try to figure out, how am I going to reconcile these worlds? I did have a friend she was the only friend actually who had the balls. She had the ovaries to call me out and say, I don't know who you are, because we would have conversations and I was always like, the back of my mind was always like, how am I going to get her saved? How am I going to, because when you dive in fully, if you're going to embrace it, you take on this lens of everybody's dying. Everybody's going to hell. Everybody. If you don't have Jesus, you're doomed. And so I don't know if I ever fully believed it, but I believed it in the moment. I grabbed onto that and I was like, I'm all in. Kind of. I say that, but oh boy, there was always a niggling. There was always a thing back here, back of the mind that was like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Stop it. But we had a conversation at one point where she called me out because she was tuned in and she could see the subtle changes in me. At one point, I don't know, I did the thing where I launched into the gospel with her and got all weird and sideways and told her that she needed to get saved and that I was scared for her and blah, blah, blah. It blew her out of the water. She didn't know what to make of that. To her, it was like some other language coming out of my mouth. It was like, wow. I think she was seeing like, oh, my Kathy gone. So it's weird. If you look at it from both sides, it's like a person watching somebody go through that and all the warning signs going off in their mind about, oh my God, she's turned into this other person. And then me looking at my friend through this other new lens of, oh my God, she's going to hell. And then we're no longer speaking the same language, Again, we're back to relationship, aren't we? Community and how we realize our lives. And I was being asked to divorce myself from what had been my community in favor of this new community. And if people from my old community weren't willing to come along for the ride, then I had to forsake them. I had to cut off, because if they were going to reject the gospel, then they were fair game for the devil and they were under the influence of that darkness. And so you can't keep a foot in that world, because then you're opening yourself up to demonic influence. It's real when you're there. With Marie, we tried to connect over time. I might have kept trying, but it always would have had that flavor that she couldn't palate. It always would have had that other motivation in the relationship, I think. Maybe, I don't know. I think at the time, like who I was at that moment, I can see why she finally said, yeah, no, sorry, I can't do it. We ended up estranged for many years and we've reconnected, but
That's
it was
awesome.
Yeah, that was hard. And she represented a very big piece of my life.
Mhm.
And so many of my friends, she was like the apex of what was the sort of severing of my connection with all of my theater friends and people who went on into the industry, people who ended up with careers and stuff. That was a horrible severing for me. And I didn't want to go through that with every one of my friends. So I then put distance between me and people who I knew would never be converted. I didn't want to have that conversation again. I didn't want to have that experience of having my preaching blow up in my face. So instead, I stopped trying, which carried with it in my new Christian world this massive load of guilt of feeling like, oh God, I'm letting all of these people go because I'm not willing to crucify myself again and again by preaching at them and trying to get them saved and then having them reject me. So it was there were so many layers to that dynamic. It was like freaking, I don't know if you allow cussing, but I'm trying to temper it. Reclaimed all of it, girlfriend.
Clear that throat chakra. I'm all about the F-bomb. Do
right?
what you have to do.
I love it. Thank you. Because that was a huge piece of myself I had to reclaim. And I tell you, I went for it in the other direction last decade. It's been like, oh, let it loose. It's fun to start using the language like in an artful way so that it has more weight.
I agree. Pack a punch. Mean what you say.
That's right.
So speaking of friends, it was actually a little bit more towards like the end of the book, the beginning of the end of the book, I should say. You meet Matt and Cheryl, who are like a really fun couple. Yeah. There's other friends in there too, but I think that Matt and Cheryl are just so significant to this conversation because they seem to be really good at balancing being them, being people who love God, and not afraid to call out the things that they see. They were talking to you and your husband about those things, and they raised their concerns to the church directly, and then they were told to leave.
Basically.
Yeah. So they were told to exit out the back door.
It was a revolving door.
Yeah, there was a lot of things going on in the church for sure. And you guys, where there's smoke, there's fire. So you guys definitely learned more after leaving, but that's jumping ahead a little bit. Yep. Cheryl gave you a book. I want to say maybe Cheryl might have planted the seed a little bit. Maybe your kids watered it.
For sure. Yeah.
Because Cheryl was like,
Yeah. Yeah. The seed that Cheryl planted, it slipped in subtly and deeply. So it was down deep in the soil, growing little hair roots, which is why she was so dangerous in the eyes of authority structures. And I think those structures exist like in the ethers also and play their roles, which is a weird, esoteric thing to say, and we could go places with that. But I do think that like her insights and just she's another one, like feet of clay, like feet on the ground, super spiritual and definitely a huge lover of God and Jesus and like the whole paradigm of Christianity, which is fine. And they're still deeply involved in church. They played a huge pivotal role. And I look at them as being like part of the rescue posse that the universe sent to me. And she gave me, I don't know how much to give here. They blew in like a breeze. I mean, honestly, when I think about the structures we were in and the culture that was there, their freeness with who they were was something that the powers that be didn't know what to do with. They couldn't be contained. They were good people, and they were people who wanted to see people know Jesus. They were evangelistic in their own way, but they also believed in being real, like being really who you were. I don't think that they bought into the authority structures that were in place that are ancient in the church, but they were also part of modern church movements that became, it was interesting because the authority structures in place within the church can be so subtle because they can back up all of their behaviors and the dogmas and the rules and dictums that they put forth with scripture.
I like to say that they have the ultimate argument for everything, which always comes down to God. And it's such a great bargaining chip.
It is. And it's slippery and it's subtle and it can be woven. It can be spun in different ways, but always it underpins these people up here know more than you know. They understand scripture a little more clearly than you do. They've heard from God in a way that has more authority and weight and power than you actually do, while saying that we all have this relationship with God that's one-on-one, that he's the only intermediary. They say that with their mouths, but their behavior and their ways of moving chess pieces around within the structure of the church it's so interestingly subtle. And that's why people stay in so long. It's because you can't get it focused. You can't get your lens dialed in to be able to say, oh, I see it. Matt and Cheryl brought that focus. They were able to say that right there, that's what I'm talking about. And they could point to specific things that you go, oh, okay, wow, man, I get it now. I'm seeing what you're saying. Then unfortunately, there's a little hook in there. So then other things that smack of that, other things that are related to that start to feel like, ugh, something's not right here. Like, oh, that was manipulative, or ooh, wow, that was passive aggressive, or whatever. So they had an incredible insight into those little things, and they didn't hold them in. They didn't keep it to themselves. They'd call it out. They'd say, what? And they just spat it out. And so often you would watch people in the church just like they'd get a little tilt on their face when some bit of truth would come out of their mouths. People would you'd see a hive pop out on their face,
Exactly.
or they'd get a little tilted,
Mm-hmm.
And I was always intrigued by that. I was like, wow, that's interestingly powerful.
They were there. Yeah. They were there to disrupt those patterns.
They were disruptors. Yeah. Yeah.
Not everybody feels this way about church and God and beliefs, but as you were speaking, I was thinking it sounds a little bit like an abusive partner with the argument of God, which is always the argument of the evangelical or the zealous person. They always have the last word because the last word is always God, which is like the ultimate thing that you could throw at somebody. And I've had experience, like a little bit of church experience and relationship dynamic experiences where it's like God, but God. It's like the ultimate gaslighting and manipulation. Like you said, it's so subtle. And the thing that keeps you from maybe being able to step back and focus is that, like, that's not their intention. That can't be their intention. The intention behind it is to serve God. So if I'm not agreeing with it, maybe it's me. Maybe I have to get closer to God, pray more, do more ministry, give more money, show up to more events, and it could go on and on and on.
The book she gave me was called The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse, teaching that we are somehow broken. We're broken. I'll use that word. Like from birth, that original sin idea is so powerful and is used by some churches. I want to be careful in and I want to be careful using the word devious, but it's such a subtle way that to me is devious at its root, that you cannot trust yourself, even after you're saved. Like you have to be like mature in the Lord before you have discernment to even discern yourself. And so if you disagree, or if you have another perspective on something, the gaslighting is such a natural part that people don't even know they're doing it. You're so young in the Lord, you couldn't possibly understand, or you don't know scripture well enough. And that's where scripture gets abused. People latch on to a piece of scripture and they say, this is what that means. The interpretation of this is being handed down from on high because you, an underling, do not have the ability yet to interpret it. And if you don't interpret it the way we interpret it, then your sin nature is still engaged. So therefore you need to pray more, fast more, serve more. As long as you're questioning your higher ups, then you still got something wrong in you. You still got some sin lodged in there. You still got some places where you're not submitted to God. It's never spoken. You know what I mean?
I totally understand that.
I honestly think those tactics and all of those things are used in all authority structures.
Absolutely. And they're the most effective when you're not outright, because it's funny, me and my friend were talking about cults, and I'm not sure if it came up because I was reading your book or if we were just talking about like a Netflix documentary or something, but she was having a conversation about it, that her boyfriend was like, I can't believe that people actually fall for that stuff. And it's like, well, they don't have a sign-up sheet. Nobody says, join my church.
Join my cult.
Do as I say, not as I do. Yeah, that plays out everywhere. Yeah. That's just the power structure at work.
And the people who do, quote unquote, fall for it, many of them are real, genuine, loving people. And that's what the structure depends upon, is these lovely people coming in who truly desire community. They want to connect. They want to love. They want to serve. I mean, we saw beautiful acts of kindness, acts of serving, self-sacrifice, which self-sacrifice isn't all bad. So when your friend who said, I don't see how people fall for that. Well, if you're hungry for community, if you're feeling isolated, if you're feeling lonely and alone, there are genuine people who come and love you. They put their arms around you, but then they don't understand that they are also practicing the very practices that are actually purposefully being practiced by the structure itself. They unknowingly do the same things. They replicate the behavior that then hooks you and pulls you slowly into the dogma and into the mindset and into the piece of it that for me becomes a cult. Because you mentioned cults. Sometimes I think, well, were you in a cult? Because like it wasn't Jim Jones and you weren't drinking Kool-Aid, although we were drinking
the Kool-Aid.
some metaphorical
Yeah.
Kool-Aid. But,
Yeah.
it wasn't a sex cult and it wasn't a satanic cult. It was some lovely people also. So I feel like using that word feels super harsh. But when you start to peel back the layers and look underneath things and get under the hood, yeah, it totally is. It
Yeah.
totally is. When there are authority structures in place manipulating people and keeping people stuck and shooing people from the community, if you do not believe this and this and you don't follow and you don't look like and you don't behave like, then is that not a cult?
Exactly.
That, to me, cult-like behavior exists in many other areas. It happens within our political arenas.
Mhm.
It's on both sides. There is cult-like behavior
Oh,
of
yeah.
right and left,
Mhm.
and maybe some of the center too. We all can
Mhm.
become part of that, and that's where I feel self-actualization, learning to hear our own wisdom and our own heart and getting super grounded in who we are at the very core of ourselves is the only way to not like get hooked into cult-like behavior. And that's where love happens and where
Mhm.
we find genuine connection to where you and I can sit down and have a conversation like this and hey, maybe a friendship blossoms, maybe,
Mhm.
you know what I'm saying? Where
Yeah.
love can
Mhm.
actually happen.
I've felt like a bunch of bells going off inside me
Yeah,
as you were
Sarah, shut up.
talking.
I want to hear what you
No,
have to
no,
say.
no, you were just like shining a light on so many things that I agree with. I loved everything that you just said because it really resonated with me. I think like, no, we're not saying that church is like this for everybody, of course,
No.
but I think that there are more situations than not where a place like a church or many different institutions blur the boundaries between what they are and the individuals that are wrapped up in the service of those institutions.
Yeah.
If somebody finds themselves in a situation like the one you found yourself in, what are some ways that you think they can know the difference between what is a healthy relationship with the institution they might find themselves in? Because I'm sure a lot of people feel that way where it's like
Yeah.
something feels a little off, but maybe it's just me.
That's a big, giant question. I have to qualify by saying that I'm not a cult expert. I'm not a psychologist or any of that. So I can only speak to my very specific experience. And I agree with you. And I want to echo and mirror what you just said and acknowledge when you said that my experience and the cult experience is not everybody's church experience. I want to validate people's faith experience because I think that every path we're on, wherever it leads, it's our truth and it's perfect and we are where we need to be. And that each one of us has to get in touch with that deepest part of ourselves. Let me give an example. I think it was in 2000. A friend of mine gave me this beautiful journal. I've been journaling for years and years, and I recommend it, by the way, journaling. The first thing I wrote in the journal was a prayer. I asked, give me wisdom and understanding and make me real. That prayer came from the deepest part of my heart. And that prayer, along with some other of the little guideposts, I can put a pin in and say it was a turning point where suddenly my heart started knowing what the
I
truth
felt
was.
that, and you did cover that in the book. And when I
Yeah.
saw that, I felt that was a turning point.
Yeah. Well, here I am 23 years later, and I still have a pin in that and know that whoever heard me, whether it was God or my highest self, that wisdom it was there for the asking. It was there because it came from the deepest part of my heart. And so we came out of the church and well, it began in 2007 and was basically complete in 2009. And that's a long time, 7 more years. But that moment where I believed that God was going to give me wisdom and understanding and make me real, it was the beginning of my discontent to where it was like, wow, everything was coming into what my husband calls my knower. I began to believe that I was getting that wisdom, and that wisdom that I trusted in 100% began to show up for me again and again. And so pay attention to that. So I would say, if you're struggling and something doesn't seem right, ask for wisdom and understanding, and to be real. Allow space for that wisdom to manifest itself in your heart, and trust it. If things begin to still not feel right, keep asking, stay curious. I really think journaling was a giant key for me too, because I could write in my own voice, and then I could answer my own questions. I would allow God's voice to come through my pen. Now I believe that was just part of the thing itself, the greater wisdom that I was being given. I believe that we know in the deepest part of ourselves what's real and what's true. And if we get quiet enough, we'll hear it. Scripture talks about the still small voice of God. I believe in that. It's getting harder to hear it because we are a culture of just constant bombardment of stimuli, entertainment, and distraction. I really believe that when we put ourselves in a space, like, at least give the opportunity to tune into that deeper part of yourself and that wisdom and that guidance. But it's required. Sometimes it'll show up in the form of a freaking accident or something or illness to lay you out so you can get quiet enough to get real with yourself and tune in with your wisdom. And many people experience that, right? They have these events that just stop them in their tracks, and they come out the other side of it saying, holy shit, I see my life in a completely different way now.
If you're not going to listen to yourself, life will come and shake you and make you listen.
But isn't that beautiful? Scary, and God damn, why do we have to suffer?
I have to keep learning these lessons.
I know. They're just going to keep coming. So square with it.
Start listening. So I'm going to ask you like some, what do you call it? Like word association questions. I'm just going to say a word and then you can tell me.
I'm a writer.
Yeah. Psychoanalysis real quick. I'm going to say a word and then you can tell me in a word or in a few words, like what comes to mind. God. I know. I should have ended with that one, but here we go.
I'll just pull a Shirley MacLaine. I am God. No kidding.
It's me. It's been me all along.
You say, what is God? I say, yes, it all is God.
I love that. That's so beautiful. Religion.
Control.
I agree with that 100%. Friendship.
Precious.
Love.
I think love is everything.
Yeah.
I don't want to use the cliche God is love, but I think love is it. It's the thing itself. It's what it's all about.
Yeah, I agree. When I think of religion, I think of fear, I think that comes through in your book with the stronghold that the church has on the members of the church, how they preach the gospel. A lot of it is so fear driven. And I wish we could get out of that message and back to the love, because there's so much fluff we put on top of the message of God and love, and we take so much away from it. It could all be so simple.
Yes, it could.
Until we come along and make it complicated. I totally stole that from Oprah too. She loves to ask people like those one word questions at the end. So that's definitely not original. What are your hopes for the future?
That's a good one. More play, getting in touch with that playful part of myself, which is why I started my podcast. Think less, play more. Embody that. More loving.
That's awesome. And I wish that for you.
Thank you. And you too. I had this interesting little vision that came up when I was meditating and journaling once. I'm still grappling with what to call God anymore. They are pretty amenable to just about anything, seemingly, because no matter what I call them, he, she, they show up and help guide me. But I was writing and journaling and struggling on the pages of my journal. And I got given this picture of dolphins in the ocean and how they're in this massive body of water, this massive force that could crush them, really. They play in it. And they don't just, they swim and they eat and they do what they do, but they play in it. They play with the waves. They play with the water. They jump over it and ride on top of it. And it's clear when you watch dolphins in the water that they are pure joy. I felt like God or the universe or my higher self or whatever was saying, take note of the dolphins, because that's what life is. Play more.
I was so
Play
deep.
more.
I love that though.
But
They straight up
simple,
frolic.
right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. They make the most out of their environment. And I think that's something we have to do too. That was really beautiful. I do have one more thing I want to ask you, actually. I was thinking of it as you were speaking. So we're in a new year. Do you get into the new year spirit? I don't want to call it hype because I don't want to downplay it. Like, I'm personally somebody who really loves the new year energy.
Yeah.
So I know some people are like, new year, new me, and other people are like, I don't want to hear it. But do you get into that? Do you have a word for the year?
Yeah. It's interesting because I've always hated the idea of New Year's resolutions, because I think of the winter as a time to go underground.
Yeah.
So I take my cues from nature. And so it's a time for me to go down into the roots, down into the soil, down into the depth and the dark, and let things pull in nutrition from that, so that spring, bang, that's when the green comes up and the flowers come up, and the fruit doesn't even come up till summer, really. So I feel like we get our calendars all miswired. You watch the animals, they're hunkering down, they're burrowing in, they're getting quiet, they're sleeping, they're digesting. And so from that, the new ideas can come, the new wisdom, the new understandings, the new creations. They're germinating, they're formulating. So for me, I like to give space for that to be happening. And I honestly don't have the energy to go, balls to the wall. It's January. Let's do it. And I'm like, I want a blankie. For me, this is a time to let little sparks come in and little ideas germinate and get in that journal and be kind of thinking toward the future. But I'm giving more space for things to like unfold naturally, so that when spring starts happening and that natural thing that we get, that unction, that horniness for life that happens, then all of that digesting that's been happening can send all the energy into the new creation. I'm trying to launch a podcast by the end of this month. So it's taking everything in me to find the energy to do that, because I'm in the wrong cycle right now. For me, the new year would be like March. You know what I'm saying? Or April, when spring is happening. That's when the new energy is actually there and available.
I feel you on that. This is that natural time where our bodies are supposed to just accept the rest. And we just have such a hard time accepting that.
Because the messages coming at us are not that.
Be productive, be productive.
Our culture doesn't allow that. We're not allowed.
That's something I'm wrestling with too. I'm transitioning from one career to another, but as I'm letting go, I'm also like grabbing onto other things.
Yeah.
And I'm realizing, calm down, release your grip. You don't have to be doing something all the time. I didn't commit to like that resolution idea this year, but I just chose a word, and it took a while to come to me, but it was live.
What does that look like to you?
It looks like I'm meeting every opportunity where it's at, and every encounter where it is, and I'm acknowledging that the present is all we have.
Behind me is a clock. My husband gave it to me, a clock with hands. And at every post on it at 12, 1, all the way around 2, 3, 4, 5, it says now all the way around. So there is no 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. There's only now, to remind me there's only this moment.
That's all there is. And I always knew that intuitively when I was younger. I would always say, this is it. All we have is the moment. And as I'm getting older, I've realized my mind is always in the past or what I need to be doing for the future. Yeah. It's not enough. I'm just trying to rewire my thinking a little bit around living. Living means being in the moment for me.
Absolutely. Good for you.
Thank you for asking me that. Where can people find you?
My author website, it's kathymartens.com. I have a podcast called Permission to Play, where I talk with creatives about ways to utilize playfulness to keep in touch with your creativity and your mojo. Because I know creatives, we struggle with depression, anxiety, getting all up in our heads instead of opening the conduit to our creative selves. So I want to provide interviews and conversations around that topic with all kinds of people.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I had a really good time. She is an amazing writer. I'm so grateful that I got to get inside of her head a little bit and get to know her better. Here's what I had to say to her about her book. You gave it so much truth, and I think you really stayed unbiased. I could feel that you weren't trying to paint anybody into a corner, and I like that too, because those experiences are just not black and white, but it was warm, it was funny. I love a book that has humor, and I can't say enough good things about it. I really loved your book.
It touches my heart. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's hard when you write your own story, put it in the world, because it's like, why am I even doing this? Why am I sharing my story?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, if it touches one person and it resonates and there's a connection, then that's worth it. Thank you for that encouragement. That makes my day.
If you guys enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor, rate and review Memoir Lane Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Memoir Lane Podcast. Take care.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. My book, Born Again Again, is available on Amazon. Please support Allison and Memoir Lane Podcast by checking her out on your favorite podcast platforms. Allison's links are also in the show notes. Also, if you could please help me grow my audience by sharing with your friends and especially subscribing to, rating, and reviewing the show. And here's a simple way you can do that. Just click the Rate This Podcast link in the show notes or go to ratethispodcast.com/permission to play. Follow 3 quick and easy steps and bam, you've helped all the people find Chatty Kathy Martens and permission to play. See how easy that was? Another way to stay in touch with me is by jumping on my email list. I send out a bi-weekly letter to my friends, keeping you in the loop on what's going on with the podcast, my writing, and all my creative antics. You just never know what she'll say next. So join the fun. The link is in the show notes and may just contain a little freebie as a way of saying welcome. Glad you're part of my community of readers. Thanks again for listening, guys. I look forward to hanging out with you again soon. Be well, and remember to think less, play more. Grant yourself permission to play.